Satanism and witchcraft, then, were lumped together indiscriminately by the Church. King James I of England was one of the primary offenders against Wicca at this time. He suffered a paranoia brought on by the Earl of Bothwell's plot against him, in which Bothwell had called on the help of the Berwick witches. Such was James's paranoia that he allowed it to influence his translation of the Bible. One place where this is particularly evident is in the substitution of the word malefica, witch, for the word venefica, poisoner. Nowhere in the actual text is the word witch used. The verses simply speak of the woman of Endor and of a woman who hath a familiar spirit. It would seem to apply just as much to a spiritualist medium as to a Wiccan. The text doesn't even say if the woman is young or old, yet thanks to King James's paranoia, generations of Christians have had a fixed notion of King Saul and an ugly old hag of a witch. In the fervor to destroy all non-Christians, hysteria broke out. Whole villages were destroyed when it was thought that one or two pagans might be living there. The cry of the bishops was, "Destroy them all, the Lord will know his own." The so-called witchcraft outbreak in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 is an excellent example of the type of hysteria that swept the whole of Europe. On the words of a group of children, a veritable reign of terror swept through a small community, ending with 20 people being sent to their death. Almost all the accused were, in actuality, very devout Christians. A prime example being old Rebecca Nurse, a bedridden lady in her 70s, whose downfall turned out to be the fact that she was deaf and therefore was unable to hear the questions put to her. Her silence was taken as an acknowledgement of guilt. During the course of the persecutions throughout Europe, it has been estimated that as many as 9 million people, men, women, and children, were put to death on a charge of witchcraft. Not 9 million witches put to death, simply 9 million people put to death on a charge of witchcraft. In fact, the vast majority of those executed were very devout Christians. Such is the harvest of religious hysteria. Certainly for many, this proved an advantageous time, for many accusations were politically motivated. If you had an enemy, you could just mutter the word witch in the right place, and your enemy will be taken away and dealt with for you. Obviously, with this sort of oppression, the old religion could not continue openly. If it was to continue, then it had to go into hiding. Wiccan groups, covens, had to meet secretly, perhaps in an isolated clearing in the woods or in a cottage far from the rest of the village. Outwardly, witchcraft had finally died, beaten to death by the earthly representatives of the God of Love and the Prince of Peace. Yet, covertly, the old religion did continue. Here and there, a sprinkling of pagan practices managed to survive, more or less openly, or occasionally disguised as Christianity. Old festivals, which refused to lie down, were frequently taken into the Christian church, perhaps with a new name. Many pagan gods suddenly became Christian saints. The church took over many of the old holy days, such as at Yule, Easter, Hallows Eve. It wasn't until as recently as 1951 that in England the last laws against witchcraft were finally repealed. At last, in the mid-20th century, if there were any witches left, they could once more come out into the open. They were free to stand up and give their side of the story. Needless to say, none pushed forward. Printing had been invented during the persecutions, so the very first books published on the subject of witchcraft were written by the opposing church. Not unnaturally, these opinions were more than a little biased. Later books could only refer back to this earlier propaganda. So for hundreds of years, anything published on the subject of the old religion has been from its enemy's point of view. Is it any wonder then that so many people hold the misconceptions that they do today? In 1921, in a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe, a well-known and respected anthropologist named Dr. Margaret Murray put forward the theory that witchcraft had actually been a religion in its own right, with pre-Christian origins. She expanded upon and gave scholarship to ideas tentatively advanced by Charles Leland 30 years earlier. In fact, she was one of the first to attempt to draw a connection between the witchcraft of the Middle Ages and the origins of religio-magic, as we have seen them here. Many of Murray's theories later proved somewhat far-fetched, or seemed to be so, and much of what she said has since been discredited, yet much has also been accepted and confirmed. In 1954, a book appeared titled Witchcraft Today. It was written by a Dr. Gerald Brousseau Gardner. In the book, Gardner said, in effect, what Margaret Murray suggested is true. Witchcraft was a religion, and in fact it still is. I know because I'm a witch. Finally, a practicing witch had come forward to give their side of the story, to start the long, hard job of restoring the balance. Gardner, after a lifetime of studying religio-magic around the world, finally retired and settled back in his native England. There, in the 1930s, he came into contact with what seemed to be one of the last surviving covens of the old religion. He was excited and delighted enough with what he found to want to run out and tell everyone how wrong they had been about witches. But he had to wait until the 1950s before he could do so. Gardner believed that the coven to which he belonged was one of the last remaining. He felt that the craft, witchcraft, really was on the edge of extinction. He was surprised and delighted when, on the publication of his book, he started to hear from many other covens across Europe, each of them in turn believing themselves to be the last alive. Gardner took over a museum of witchcraft and magic, started by Cecil Williamson on the Isle of Man in the middle of the Irish Sea. It was housed in an old mill, itself for centuries associated with the local Arbury witches. This became his headquarters, and from there he put out a second book, complementing the first, and titled The Meaning of Witchcraft. Until his death on February the 12th, 1964, Gardner was rightfully regarded as the grand old man of witchcraft, being solely responsible for igniting the flame of Wiccan revival. All present-day Wiccans owe Gardner a deep debt of gratitude, for without his pioneering work in straightening misconceptions, it's doubtful the old religion will be back where it is today. With the revelation that Wicca was not only an organized religion, but a benevolent one at that, championing love and joy, many people came to see its tenets as refreshing and eminently sensible, and very much preferable when compared to the doom and gloom of modern-day Western religions. The return of the old religion had begun. I was myself responsible for introducing Wicca, Gardner's branch of it, to the United States, having been initiated by his high priestess only the year before he died. This was a time when there was no modern witchcraft visible in this country. Initially, Gardnerian, the name given to his modified form of Celtic Wicca, was the only form of the religion available. It took many years for others to gain courage from Gardner and from his example and to stand up and be recognized. But soon it became apparent not only that the craft was alive and well, but also, as with Christianity, that there were many different forms of the old religion being practiced and therefore available to the seeker. In recent years, there has been some dispute as to whether today's Wicca is truly a direct descendant of the old religion of pre-Christianity, or whether it is a much newer, 20th century-born variety, merely claiming lineage. This is a dispute that will probably continue for generations. I think it's unimportant which it is. The main thing is that present-day witchcraft is now a full-blooded, thriving religion, filling the spiritual needs of tens of thousands of people around the world. We live in an age of reason, when people are encouraged to think and choose for themselves. This is also, supposedly, an age of religious tolerance. Hopefully, we can confirm that by seeing Wicca finally become accepted for what it is, just another religious path that leads to the same center. And what of the future of Wicca? It still has a very long way to go to be generally accepted for what it is. Let's not forget that we have centuries of propaganda to overcome. Yet overcome it we shall, of that I'm certain. It will continue to be a long uphill climb, with plenty of temporary setbacks. But so long as there are Wiccans willing to work at educating Cowans, non-witches, and willing to keep straightening out the misconceptions, then one day, I'm sure, we'll finally win back our religious freedom. There are already strong steps in that direction. The federal government recognizes Wicca as an alternate religion, it being included in Department of the Army pamphlet number 165-13, Religious Requirements and Practices of Certain Selected Groups, a Handbook for Chaplains. In many states, there are legally established Wiccan churches, accepted by the IRS as non-profit religious organizations. In various state penitentiaries, prisoners are allowed to practice Wiccan rites and to be visited by Wiccan clergy. So what are the Wiccan rites? Just what is involved in this religious practice? Let's look now at the mechanics of the old religion. What does a coven, a group of witches, do? How does a solitary witch practice? It must first be understood that Wicca is very free-flowing, without the stiff, unbending rules found in many other traditional religions. It gives far more opportunity for individual expression. There are a number of well-established traditions such as Gardnerian, Alexandrian, Saxon, Celtic, and so on. There are also many non-traditional groups that label themselves eclectic, borrowing bits and pieces from here and there. But whatever the name, there are certain basics that have to be observed if the group or individual is to be truly Wiccan, rather than just falling under the general heading of pagan. These basics include the preparation and use of the meeting place, the form of service, celebration of festivals, belief in deity, reincarnation and retribution, and adherence to the Wiccan Rede. Let's start our study of all this by looking first at dress. In a survey of contemporary paintings and illustrations of medieval witches, it was found that some practiced clothed while an equal number practiced naked. A large number of present-day Wiccans opt for being naked in their rites. Indeed, some traditions hold it as one of their tenets.
Once in the month, and better it be when the moon is full, ye shall gather in some secret place and adore me, who am queen of all witchery. And as a sign that ye be free, ye should be naked in your rites.
Other Wiccans prefer to be clothed, usually wearing loose robes, though naked beneath those robes. Incidentally, rather than the word naked, most Wiccans prefer the picturesque term sky-clad, clad only by the sky. If you are working alone, you can choose whichever you feel more comfortable with. If you are starting from scratch with a new group, then let it be a unanimous decision, be it for sky-clad or robed. Do not mix the two, and as in all things in the craft, let no one be coerced into anything. So far as jewelry goes, my personal feeling is that moderation should be the watchword. Within the circle, some traditions use jewelry to distinguish rank. This is with the degree systems usually. For example, in Gardnerian, all female Wiccans wear a necklace, which symbolizes the circle of rebirth. The priest and priestess each wear individual bracelets of a certain design to show that they are who they are. And a witch queen, or queen of the Sabbat, in Gardnerian, this is a priestess who has had other covens break off from hers. She will wear a silver crescent moon crown and a green garter, the garter bearing a silver buckle for each coven over which she rules.